Montana Territory, autumn of 1874, just outside the mining town of Silver Flats, the screaming started at dawn. No, no, please. The woman's voice cracked as two men dragged her from the edge of the cemetery, her dress catching on the frozen grass, her knees blackened with dirt. Let me stay. Those are my babies, she kicked, fought, cried too loud, and that was why they pulled her away. The sheriff, red-cheeked and embarrassed, stood nearby with his hat low. That's enough, Miss Palmer. The town's done all it can. The woman, Naomi Palmer, 22 and barefoot in the frost, was shoved onto the wooden steps of the jailhouse porch and left there like luggage. Her hands trembled, her eyes swollen near shut. Her voice was raw from sobbing over two tiny graves dug the day before. The townsfolk whispered, then slowly turned their backs. Some said she had lost her mind. Others said she had never had much to begin with. Not one person helped, except one man. He was leaning up against his roan, gelding across the street, a worn hat shadowing his face, arms crossed over a dust-covered canvas coat. He had not moved the entire time she had screamed, but now he did. He walked straight across the street with heavy, calm steps. He did not speak to the sheriff. He did not look at the townfolk. He crouched down in front of her. His boots were mud-caked, his jaw dark with stubble. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and low. I am sorry about your children, her head turned, slowly. Like something broken inside her was trying to remember how to meet kindness. You do not know me, she rasped. No, he said, but I think you need someone who will sit a while. He stood and took off his hat. Without a word, he put it on her head. Naomi blinked up at him. The hat was far too big, but it smelled of sun and horse leather, and her shivering shoulders seemed to settle under it. Why would you help me? She asked. Because no one else did, he said. He offered a hand. She stared at it. I am Dawson Ellery, he added, quiet. I got no wife, no children. No reason to be anywhere in particular. She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. He helped her to her feet like she weighed nothing. She winced when she stood, her knees scraped and bleeding. Without asking, Dawson led her to his horse and helped her up. He climbed after her, settling behind her in the saddle. He did not touch her more than needed, just enough to keep her steady. They rode out of Silver Flats in silence. No one stopped them. No one cared. His land was 2 hours north, tucked between two ridges and a frozen creek. The cabin was small but solid, made of pine logs and roofed with thick shakes. No one had ever shared it with him. Until now, Naomi sat on the edge of the bed while Dawson boiled water. She did not speak. She had not asked where they were going while they rode. She simply leaned into the warmth of his coat and stayed quiet. He brought over a tin cup of hot water and crouched in front of her again. I got no sugar, but it will warm you. She took it with shaking hands. Thank you, she whispered. You can sleep here, he said. I will take the cot near the stove. She looked up at him, eyes red, face pale. I had 2 boys, she said suddenly. Elias was 4, Emmett was 2. Fever took them in 3 days. Dawson's jaw moved, but he said nothing. He just nodded. I screamed too loud, she said, bitter. That is why the sheriff told them to drag me away. You screamed because you loved them. Her hand tightened on the cup. I do not know how to keep breathing without them. You do not have to know yet, he said. Just breathe for tonight. She nodded once, then again, and again. That night, Naomi slipped into sleep for the first time in 4 days. Dawson sat near the stove, arms crossed, his eyes never leaving her. The next morning, she woke to the smell of cornbread and coffee. She sat up slowly. Her dress was wrinkled, her hair tangled. But she looked stronger somehow. Her voice was clearer. You built all this yourself, she asked. Dawson turned from the stove and nodded. Lived here 6 years. Worked for the stage line before that. Bought this land with my pay. Naomi looked around. The cabin was neat. A few shelves lined with books. A rifle hung over the door. A thick wool blanket folded over the chair. I thought I would die yesterday, she said. You did not. She stepped closer. Her fingers grazed the edge of the table. I cannot go back to Silver Flats. You are not going back, she blinked. You would let me stay. I would let you stay as long as you want to. She stared at him, his quiet strength, his calm eyes, his hands rough and gentle. She did not understand him, but she believed him. For the first time in weeks, the weight in her chest let up. My boys are buried there, she said. I know. I want to bring them here. Someday we will. Naomi looked up sharply at the word. He met her gaze. You are not alone anymore. She pressed a hand to her mouth. Then she nodded. Days passed. She helped with the firewood. He taught her how to use the old pump shotgun. She mended one of his shirts and hung her dress to dry beside his. They did not speak of love. They did not hold hands. But something lived in the way she poured his coffee and the way he made sure her boots were by the fire each night. And every morning she wore his hat. It was too big. It made her smile. He smiled back. One morning she stepped outside and found him chopping wood. She crossed the yard and stood beside him. He paused. You all right? He asked. She nodded. I think I am. He wiped sweat from his brow. I keep thinking about what you did, she said. Back in town, the way you looked at me, the way you put your hat on my head. He started. No, she cut in. You saw me when no one else did. He lowered the axe. I want to stay, she said. He straightened, looked at her. I want to stay with you. He stepped closer. Naomi, her breath hitched. I do not want you to stay because you feel like you owe me anything. I do not, she said. I want to stay because I feel safe, because I feel something I did not think I would ever feel again. He reached out slowly and touched her cheek with the back of his hand. I feel it too, he said. She leaned into him, and for the first time he kissed her. It was soft, simple, no rush, just two people broken by the world finding something whole in each other. She smiled against his mouth, and he smiled back. The first hard snow came early that year, sweeping across the ridges with a dry, bitter wind that cut through even the thickest wool. Dawson stood in the barn brushing down the gelding, the old cedar boards creaking under his boots. Naomi was inside the cabin, stitching patches into the elbows of his second warmest coat. Her hands still bore faint lines from where she'd gripped the edges of the boys' blankets too tightly during their last hours. But she stitched steady now, with a kind of quiet determination that hadn't been there before. Dawson ran a hand down the horse's neck and glanced toward the cabin window. The lamplight inside flickered soft, casting her shadow against the curtain. He hadn't asked her to stay past the thaw, hadn't pressed her for anything. But every morning she got up and swept the cabin floor like she meant to be there for good. Later, as the wind picked up, she opened the door and leaned out, her cheeks red from the stove's heat. You got any kindling cut? She asked, holding her shawl tight around her shoulders. He nodded once and wiped his hands on his trousers. Stacks behind the smokehouse. She stepped out, boots crunching over the crusted snow, and rounded the corner. Dawson watched her go, then turned back to the horse. She came back with her arms full and a flush creeping up her neck. I saw dear Prince, she said as she shook the snow off her skirt. Small set, might be a young one. Could be, he said, taking the bundle from her. Tracks come in close, past the creek, just barely. She hesitated, then added, I could walk it tomorrow if you lend me your rifle. He paused, surprised. You hunt, my pa taught me, before he passed. Her voice didn't falter. It's been years, but I remember what matters. He studied her face a moment, how the rawness had settled into steadiness. Then he nodded and handed her the rifle from above the door. You take my gloves too. Leather's thick enough to keep your hands from freezing. She gave a short nod of thanks and reached for the gloves resting near the hearth. That night, they shared a plate of beans and boiled potatoes. Naomi asked if he'd always lived alone. He chewed slowly before answering. Not always. I had a brother, younger, went out east to school and never came back, died in a rail accident outside of St. Louis. What was his name? Wesley. She didn't say sorry, just looked down and nodded once. In the quiet after supper, she took out a piece of calico and began cutting strips for a quilt. He watched her hands move with purpose. You planning to stay through spring? He asked, not looking at her. She didn't answer right away. Then, without lifting her eyes, said, I was thinking I'd fix up the shed. Could use it for drying herbs come summer. He let out a slow breath through his nose and leaned back in his chair. I'd like that. She reached for another strip of fabric. You got a middle name, James. She looked up. Dawson James Ellery, she said like she was weighing it in her mouth. Sounds like someone who builds cabins and keeps his word. He gave a quiet hum of agreement. What about you? He asked. You got one. She set her scissors down. Naomi Ruth. Naomi Ruth Palmer, he said, testing it the way she had his. Sounds like someone who doesn't scare easy. She met his eyes. I don't anymore. He nodded once, and nothing more passed between them that night. In the morning, she was gone before first light. The rifle slung over her back, a strip of dried venison in her pocket, and Dawson's gloves pulled up to her elbows. By midday, the cabin smelled of juniper and smoke. She returned with a hare in one hand and a bloodied knife in the other. "Couldn't find the deer," she said, brushing snow from her cloak. "But supper's settled." He took the hare wordlessly and began skinning it over the basin. "You ever think about building onto the cabin?" she asked as she hung her cloak near the fire. "Sometimes. Thought maybe one day I'd need the room." She bent to stir the coals. "Might be time." He didn't look up, just kept his hands moving steady. That night, she sat with her back against his side while he read aloud from a book of essays someone had left behind years ago. Her head tilted slightly, eyes half closed. Her hand rested lightly on his knee. He turned the page and kept reading. She didn't move. He didn't ask her to. Outside, the wind softened. Inside, the silence between their words filled with something warm and steady, something that didn't need naming. By mid-December, the snow no longer came in flurries. It settled deep and stayed, burying the fences halfway and muffling every sound with a stillness that felt sacred. Naomi stood behind the cabin, knees braced in the drift, sawing through a fallen aspen limb with steady arms. Dawson was out toward the far ridge, checking the trapline before the next snow buried his markers. She'd insisted he leave her something to do. He had. The saw rasped and caught, and her breath left her in cloudy puffs. When she finally freed the limb, she dragged it toward the woodpile, her boots crunching through the crust. There'd been no sunlight all week, but the cold had a brightness to it all the same. Inside, she warmed her hands over the cookstove and peeled off her gloves. The quiet in the cabin had grown comfortable. She no longer listened for the sound of crying, no longer woke in a sweat, reaching for blankets that weren't there. That afternoon, Dawson returned with a brace of grouse and a gash across his forearm where a trap had snapped back as he reset it. "You wrap that in anything?" she asked, already wetting clean cloth. Snow on the way back, held well enough. She pulled a chair beside him and cleaned the wound without a word. His jaw tensed, but he didn't flinch. When she stitched it with thread boiled in vinegar, he watched her hands, not the needle. "You've done this before," he said, voice rough. "Pa split his palm once, dragging a muley harness too fast. I was 12. He didn't have the coin for a doctor. When she finished, she tied the last knot tight and leaned back. "You should rest it. I've got no plans to be reckless." She raised a brow. "You climbed down a frozen creek with a busted trap." His mouth twitched, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Fair." That evening, they shared the grouse. Naomi added dried sage and a bit of onion she'd kept tucked in the root cellar. The meat came out tender, the skin dark and crisp. After, she pulled a small bundle from her trunk, wrapped in an old square of muslin. Dawson watched as she laid it open across the table. 2 carved wooden horses, worn smooth with age. One had a broken leg, glued long ago. The other bore faint burn marks on its back. "I thought I'd buried them," she said, her voice hushed. "But I found them wrapped in the bottom of my satchel when I unpacked. Elias carried them everywhere, even to bed." He reached out, careful not to touch, just looking. They were always in his pockets. "I told him he'd lose them someday." Her throat worked. "He never did." She gathered them back into the cloth and folded it once, then again. "I'd like to make a shelf, something small for them." Dawson nodded. "We've got maple in the shed. I'll help you cut a piece before the weekend." She looked up, eyes steady. "Thank you." He didn't say anything more, but he stood and fetched his leather tools from the chest near the hearth. He set them beside her carefully, one by one. The next morning, she spent hours smoothing the wood with a scrap of sandpaper. By sundown, they'd mounted the shelf beside the window, and the horses sat beneath a curtain of pine branches she'd woven into a garland. That night, Naomi didn't sit across from him. She sat beside him on the bench, close enough their shoulders touched as he read aloud from a borrowed copy of Emerson's essays. When he closed the book, she didn't move away. "I used to think strength was something loud," she said quietly. "Like shouting or standing taller than someone else, but it's not." He turned toward her. "It's holding still," she said. "When you want to run," Dawson took her hand, his fingers rough and warm around hers. You've held still through a great deal, he said. She looked down, then up again. I think I want to marry you, she said, her voice low and certain. Not someday, not after more time, I think I want it now. His thumb moved slow over her knuckles. I've wanted that since I saw you look up from the jail porch. She blinked once. Then leaned forward and kissed him, long and sure. The next day, they rode into the valley near Whetstone Ridge, where the circuit preacher stayed through the winter. Naomi wore a navy wool dress that had belonged to her mother, and Dawson wore his cleanest shirt and the same hat he'd set on her head that first morning. There were no witnesses but Snow and Sky and the preacher's wife, who handed Naomi a sprig of winterberry from her garden as a blessing. When they rode home, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting a golden wash across the peaks. That night, Dawson placed his arm around her shoulders as they sat before the fire, and she leaned into him with the ease of someone who had found her place in the world. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The January thaw came late that year, and when it did, it crept in slow, seeping into the seams of the cabin and loosening the ice along the creek's edge. Naomi stood barefoot on the plank floor, warming her toes near the open stove, as she stitched a lining into the heavy wool coat Dawson had outgrown the previous winter. The hem had frayed, but the fabric was solid. She'd cut it down to fit her shoulders. Dawson returned from the barn with melted snow soaking the cuffs of his trousers. He hung his coat on the peg, then crouched to unlace his boots, his hands stiff with cold. I found old fence wire behind the hay barrels, he said, setting his boots by the door. Could mend that stretch south of the bluff. Elk keep pressing through. I'll come with you. We can bring the sled, haul back kindling along the ridge, she said, folding the coat across her lap. He reached for the kettle, poured water into the tin basin, and washed the dirt from his palms. You ever work with wire? Pa taught me to brace posts with stone. I can twist a line tight. He nodded, drying his hands. Then we'll go first light. That night, she woke to the sound of sleet tapping the shutters and the warmth of Dawson's hand resting against her hip beneath the quilts. She stayed still, listening to his slow breath. When morning came, the sleet had hardened into a crust and the air smelled of thawed pine. They packed the sled with tools and bread wrapped in cloth. Naomi walked ahead, the sled rope looped around her waist, boots crunching over the softened snow. When they reached the broken fence, Dawson knelt to test the anchoring stones while she uncoiled the rusted wire. You ever think of building a corral? She asked, pressing a glove to her brow to shield her eyes from the sun. I've thought it, he said. But never had a reason to keep anything penned. She passed him the hammer. Might be different now. He looked at her, brow shaded beneath his brim. You thinking of goats again? I'm thinking of milk and wool. And not relying on trade goods from town that take half the day to reach. He drove the nail through the brace post and stood. You want goats, we'll build for goats. They worked until midday. Naomi's arms ached from holding the wire taut. Dawson's shirt clung damp to his back, but neither complained. When they stopped to eat, they sat side by side on a flat stone, the bread dry but welcome. Did you always want to settle out here? She asked, brushing crumbs from her skirt. I didn't think I'd settle at all, he said. Thought I'd keep moving, but one day I stopped riding and didn't feel the need to start up again. She looked out over the ridge where the snow was melting in dark veins along the slope. I used to picture a little house on a hill, chickens, someplace quiet. I thought that dream died with the boys. He reached for her hand, stilling her fingers. It didn't. She turned her face toward him, her eyes clear but edged with something deeper. I want to plant potatoes this spring, she said. I want to dig the rows myself. I want to watch something grow again. We'll plant more than potatoes, he said. We'll fill the whole yard if you want. She smiled, small and sure. When they returned to the cabin, the light was fading. Naomi lit the lantern while Dawson shook snow from the tools and set them by the hearth to dry. She turned toward him, her hands resting against the table's edge. I've been thinking, she said. About a name. He looked up from unlacing his boots. For us, she continued. For this place, he stood, brushing his hands on his trousers. Go on. I want to call it Quiet Hollow, she said. Not because it's silent, but because it feels like peace. He stepped close, touched her cheek with the edge of his thumb. Then Quiet Hollow it is. She leaned into him, the lamp casting their shadows across the wall. He kissed her slow, the way a man does when there's no rush left in him, only the steady promise of staying. Outside, the last snow of winter softened into the earth. Inside, warmth held. By March, the earth had softened enough to take a spade. Naomi knelt by the edge of the yard, sleeves rolled past her elbows, the smell of thawed soil rising in gentle curls. Dawson had strung a low fence from cedar branches to keep the mule off the planting rows, and now he stood nearby, splitting seed potatoes with a steady hand. "Did I tell you my mother used to set her rows by moonlight?" Naomi asked, pushing her blade into the ground. "Said it kept rot off the roots." Dawson looked up. "You believe that?" "I don't know," she said, "but her garden never failed." He watched her for a moment, the way she worked with quiet purpose, then passed her the next handful of cuttings. "Then we'll plant by the moon." They worked until the sun dipped behind the ridge. The first row lay neat and dark and promising. Naomi stood, pressing her palms against her lower back. "You ache?" Dawson asked, already brushing off his hands. "Some," she said. "But it's the good kind." Inside, she warmed water from the kettle and wiped the dirt from her arms. Dawson had set the table with cornbread and the last of the smoked trout, and they ate in easy silence, their hands brushing when they passed the butter tin. Later that week, Dawson rode into Silver Flats. It was his first time back since the morning he'd carried Naomi away. He tied the gelding near the smithy and stepped into the general store with a list she'd written in her careful, narrow hand: flaxseed, molasses, a length of unbleached muslin, Mrs. Trent, who ran the counter, squinted at him. "You're Ellery, right? Folks said you took that Palmer girl up into the hills." He met her gaze evenly. "Her name is Naomi Ellery now." Mrs. Trent's mouth twitched. "Well then, best get her some proper soap for spring washing." "I've got Rose and Lye." "Rose," he said. He left with the bundle tied tight and rode home before the sun slipped too low. Naomi met him at the fence, her hands wrapped in a shawl she'd pieced from old flannel. "You made good time," she said, taking the parcel. "I didn't linger." She touched his arm. "Thank you." That night she unwrapped the muslin and ran it through her fingers. "I want to make something for the table, a cloth with needlework, something that belongs only here." He leaned back in the chair near the stove. "What'll you stitch?" "I was thinking 2 pine trees, one taller, one younger, close together." He didn't speak, but his eyes softened. By April, the creek ran fast and clear, and Naomi's rose showed the first pale green shoots. The snow was gone from the ridge, and birds had returned to the trees. Dawson repaired the roof with fresh thatch while Naomi washed linens in the shallows, her skirts tucked into her belt, hair braided down her back. One afternoon, as they worked side by side sanding new boards for the pantry shelves, Dawson paused. "I've been thinking," he said, brushing sawdust from his sleeve, "about building another room." She looked over, curious. "Not for work, not for storage." He hesitated. "If we ever have children again." She set down the plane and wiped her hands. "You want that, if it's what you want." She stepped closer, her eyes searching his. "I do," he nodded slowly. "Then I'll start clearing the space come summer." Her hands slid into his, fingers lacing. "I never thought I'd be ready," she said. "But I am. I'll be with you in all of it." That night, as they lay in bed, Naomi rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I feel them less often now," she whispered. "The boys, not because I forget, but because it hurts less to remember." He ran his fingers through her hair, slow and gentle. "Maybe they're part of the peace now." She closed her eyes. "Maybe so." The seasons turned. By late May, the seedlings had grown waist-high, and Naomi's muslin cloth lay over the table with 2 pine trees stitched in faded green thread. The pantry shelves were full of dried herbs and jars of preserved eggs. Dawson had framed the new room, and Naomi had lined the windows with lengths of blue calico. One morning, she stood at the threshold of the cabin, watching the fog lift from the ridge. Dawson came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Do you ever miss the road?" she asked. "No," he said. "The road never gave me this." She turned in his arms, her eyes bright. "I love you," he kissed her gently. "And I love you." They stayed like that as the sun rose, the light spilling across Quiet Hollow like a blessing. Years passed. The new room filled with the sound of a child's laughter, a girl with Dawson's eyes and Naomi's quiet strength. They named her Ruthie, after the middle name Naomi had once spoken so softly by the fire. The cabin grew fuller. Not just with life, but with proof that healing could be slow and lasting and real. Proof that two people carved down by grief could build something whole from what remained, and every spring Naomi planted by the moon. Every autumn, Dawson split the cedar for the fence anew. They grew together, not in words, but in the way their lives wove into one another so completely that no line could be drawn between them. They never left quiet hollow. They didn't need to, because love, once found and held, doesn't ask for anywhere else to go.